Before we begin, take a deep breath. Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Ken, where in the world are you listening from? Leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if this kind of slow, immersive history helps you sleep, tap the subscribe button. It's free, and it helps us keep making videos like this. Now, let's begin. Asterisk. It is said that the path to the fortress of Alamet began not with footsteps, but with silence at the foot of the mountains in northern Persia, around the 11th century. The fortress rose like a phantom, carved from the very bones of the earth. Few had seen it, fewer had returned. For those who did, their stories were muted, eyes blank, mouths unsure. But among them, one pattern echoed. No one was born an assassin. They were trained, and that training often began at the age of 12. You, for example, might have been a quiet shepherd's child. The third son, perhaps, or the second daughter, too small to inherit land, too weak for labor, and too clever to ignore. Your father, if he had debts or enemies, might have handed you over in the dark without a goodbye. Or maybe a traveler, cane-cloaked, silver-bearded dad, spoke to your mother of a life of purpose, a life of precision. He might have offered her coins, or merely relief. The journey from the lowlands took 3 days by foot, sometimes more. But for you and the other chosen children, it felt longer. You weren't allowed to speak during the climb, not to each other, not to your mind. Silence was part of the test. The cliffs narrowed like the ribs of a closing hand. Wind bit without warning. The air thinned. She began to see the world below as small, irrelevant. Villages became dots. Your old life, a blur. The man leading you said nothing, not even when one boy slipped on gravel and broke 2 fingers. He was told to keep walking. He did. Finally, the path narrowed into a crevice, a hidden trail, so thin it could vanish with a landslide. Beyond that, the stone walls of Alamet emerged, as if the mountain had grown its own defenses. No flags, no gates, just a stillness, too disciplined to be natural. Inside, everything changed. You were not welcomed. You were watched. The hallway floors were padded with goat hide so that no step could echo. You could not run here or hide. You were assigned a room, not a bed. Okay? A mat, a pail, and a coarse wool robe were your only possessions. No mirrors. Okay. Number. Names. You weren't allowed to speak for your first 7 days. Not even to ask questions. Communication was done through gesture, glance, posture. They said it trained the body to think before the mouth could ruin everything. Food came twice a day. Flatbread soaked in goat's milk. Dates, if you had shown. Obedience, if you had not, just the bread. One girl asked for water and was struck gently, not hard enough to injure, but enough to remember. The lessons began on the 8th day. There were no introductions, just movement. You were awoken before sunrise by the sound of water dripping into a stone bowl, 10 drops. That was the time to be dressed, kneeling and facing the wall. A man entered and dropped a wooden stick at your feet. Silence, he said, and left. That was it. No explanation. You were to discover how long you could keep the stick balanced on 2 fingers, eyes closed, feet together. By the 3rd day, some could do it for hours. This was not play. It was calibration. Every lesson in Alamet carried 3 meanings: the visible one, the silent one, and the hidden one. If you thought it was just about balance, you'd already failed. By the 2nd week, your limbs ached in new places. A simple command like walk across this beam might take 10 tries before they'd accept your posture. You learned to listen to wind direction. You could hear the difference between a falling leaf and a mouse. And most importantly, you were taught that hesitation was louder than any shout. In your 3rd week, the idea of death was introduced, but not as a warning. It was framed as a natural law. You were shown a bird, its neck broken cleanly, still, warm. You were told it had once served as a message courier, okay? And then you were told to pluck it in silence. The act wasn't about cruelty. It was about clarity, okay? In this fortress, every act had purpose. Even the smallest bird had been part of a message no one else could decode. Later, when asked what you had learned from the dead bird, a few children said that killing is easy. They were removed. You never saw them again. The correct answer was nothing. You had learned nothing yet. And so, the lesson would continue. Some nights, soft drums echoed from far corners of the fortress low. Deep rhythms that didn't follow music, but seemed to echo a heartbeat. One boy claimed they were meant to simulate fear. Another said it was the rhythm of the mountain. The truth was, no one knew, and no one dared ask. Time warped in the high walls of Alamant. Days blurred. You didn't know whether it had been a month or a year, but something in your body changed. You could sense a person behind you without turning. You could hold your breath for 3 minutes without strain, okay? You could climb stone using just fingers and a rope of hair. Then, one morning, they placed a blade in your hand. It was not sharp. It was not polished, but it was yours. And with it came a single question. What do you think the blade is for? You were told to answer not with words, but with your actions. And that is when everything changed. Asterisk, the blade they gave you wasn't meant to impress. It wasn't curved or jeweled. There was no inscription, no leather-wrapped hilt, no ceremony in its delivery. It's cold iron, not sharp enough to cut cloth, yet heavy enough to remind you that the weight of death could be held in one hand. You were told to act, not speak. No instructions were given, no targets identified. But you understood because, by now, silence had taught you more than speech ever could. Some of the other children froze. One girl simply laid her blade on the stone floor and folded her hands. Another boy mimed stabbing the wall, but was immediately taken away. Not punished, just removed. Their presence was erased quietly, as if they had never been there. Beds rolled up, mats gone. No one spoke of them again. You watched, you waited, and then you acted. You walked past your fellow initiates, toward the stone basin near the wall, where fruit had been left as offering for the birds that nested in the tower crevices. With the blade, you tapped the rim of the basin. Once, twice, 3 times. A rhythm. Then you placed the blade inside the bowl and stepped back. Hands open, the men watching you hooded, silent, older than time, nodded once. That was all. Later that night, the blade returned to your mat, sharpened dot. From then on, the training grew harder, okay? It was no longer about the body. It was about the mind. You were taught to read faces, not emotions, but micro-reactions. A twitch near the eye, a pause in breath, a shift in heel weight. These signs were more important than any scroll or letter, because messages could be forged, but fear could not. One week, you were tasked with serving the kitchen. Seemed like a demotion. But there, you learned how temperature changed the smell of broth, how bitter herbs could mask the presence of sedatives, how a poison didn't always need to kill it, just needed to silence. You were taught that a successful assassination wasn't about murder. It was about movement, clean, untraceable. Sometimes, your role was not to kill but to watch, or to listen. One morning, you were taken to the rooftop garden. There was a single man sitting there, elderly, thin, wrapped in white. A teacher, or perhaps a master. His name was never spoken. He pointed at a bird that had landed on a tree branch. You nodded. He handed you a sling. You had used one before, as a child, for play. Not here. You took the sling. You weighed the stone. The bird was still. You released. The bird flew before the stone reached it. The master turned to you and said that everything must die when it is within reach. That evening, Your food was doubled, and no explanation was given. There were no congratulations in Alamet, only progression or silence. As your skills grew, so did the responsibilities. You were sent to the lower villages, in pairs, just as beggars or boys seeking work. You weren't given missions. You were given scenarios. One day, you were told, a merchant has insulted the fortress. Do what must be done. You found the merchant. He was young, soft-eyed. He sold saffron and copper pots. He had 2 sons and a limp. You watched him for 2 days. On the 3rd day, you returned with nothing. When asked, you said, his insult was not meant to wound. They asked, do you think insult is about intention or impact? You answered, both. But mercy can be more confusing than vengeance. There was silence. Then a voice said, you will go again tomorrow, this time without returning. You didn't sleep that night. The next day, you walked past the merchant's stall. You did nothing, and you didn't return. For 2 nights, you slept beneath a tree outside the fortress gates. You ate nothing, drank only when it rained. On the 3rd night, a boy came with bread and a note. It read, you understand patience. The gates opened. You were 13 now, and you were assigned a mentor. His name was Kashar. He did not speak unless absolutely required. But when he did, his voice was so calm it made even the stone around him listen. He had trained in Alimat before the current imam had even been born. His eyes had seen cities rise and fall. And still, he spoke like the world would never change. Kashajar did not teach through demonstration. He taught through disappearance. One morning, he was gone. No note, no command. It's gone. You searched. 4 days, through the tunnels beneath the kitchen, the crawl spaces behind the archives. You even tried the outer walls, balancing barefoot on ledges wide enough only for sparrows. Then, one evening at dusk, as the sun broke itself against the western cliffs, you saw him sitting quietly at the edge of the well. He looked at you and said, "You're ready?" You asked, "For what?" He said, "To forget your name." It felt like the last part of you, the child. The questions, appease, the memories was now a weight that had to be thrown off the cliff. And so, you did. Your name was no longer yours. You were now a whisper, a shadow. You were now Fida Wind, who sacrifices. The training shifted again. Now it was about infiltration. How to memorize a map, by candlelight in 10 seconds. How to breathe without sound for 30 minutes. How to enter a walled home by using the layout of a nearby bakery's chimney smoke. One task involved climbing into a hall full of sleeping men and removing a ring from the leader's finger without waking him. You failed the first time. The second time, you retrieved the wrong hand. The third time, you succeeded. They never told you what the ring meant, but it was never mentioned again. By now, you were nearly 14. You had not seen your family. You had forgotten their voices. The fortress was not your prison. It was your skin. And then came your final trial. You were brought before a room with no windows. Just one stool, one candle, and a piece of parchment. They gave you a name, a real name. A man in the city of Ray. A known traitor to the Imam. Someone whose actions had caused the death of 2 operatives. Your orders were clear. Confirm his location. Observe for 1 week. If truth aligns, do what must be done. There was no thrill, no fear, just focus. You left that night with Kashar. He walked with you for half the journey. Then he stopped. "You are not alone," he said, "but no one will help you." "Hey," he handed you a vial, just in case. You nodded and walked into the desert. Behind you, the fortress vanished into the cliffs, as if it had never been there. Ahead of you, the city paused like a heartbeat under fog dot, and somewhere within it, the man with the name. But what would you do if the truth wasn't as clean as the parchment made it seem? What if assassins weren't just trained to kill? What if they were trained to understand? Asterisk. You reached the city of Ray just before dusk. It spread like a low wound beneath the foothills, its clay rooftops bleeding heat back into the sky, its alleyways steeped in the smells of bread, sweat, and something older regret, perhaps. You walked in with a merchant caravan and vanished into the noise. No one noticed. That was the point. You didn't look like a boy anymore. The robe you wore was weather-stained, your shoulders lean but firm, your gaze never resting too long in one place. You blinked only when the body was safe to do so. You moved into spaces between motions, like water slipping past rocks. You found the man on your second day. His name was Masra ibn Rafi. He sold paper, expensive, imported parchment from Samarkand. He wore blue robes with embroidered cuffs and sat outside his shop like a priest with no temple. His beard was trimmed too neatly for a poor man. His sandals were too clean, but his eyes, they carried the fatigue of someone who had waited too long to be forgotten. You watched him from the bakery, roof across the street, from the carpet, cellar's stall, from the shadows of the public bath. You observed everything when he opened shop, when he counted coins, when he scratched the scar on his left wrist without realizing. On the fourth day, you followed him home. He lived behind a mosque in a narrow courtyard lit by oil lamps that smoked too much to be useful. His home was small. One room, 2 windows. No servants. He had a daughter that wasn't in the parchment. She was maybe 6, maybe 8. She fed the pigeons with her left hand and sang off-key in the courtyard when she thought no one was listening. Her presence complicated things, and complications meant failure. You weren't trained to hesitate, but you were trained to notice. That night, you didn't return to your rooftop. You stayed near the courtyard beneath a crumbling wall. You listened to Masra hum a lullaby as he washed his daughter's feet with warm water. He spoke softly to her in Turkish. You understood enough to hear that he feared the coming winter. Not the fortress, not the imam, just the cold. You clutched the blade inside your sleeve and didn't move. The next morning, Maza left early. The girl stayed behind. This was your chance. You entered the house as the sun rose. The door wasn't even locked inside. It smelled of cardamom and dust. A prayer mat had been folded neatly in the corner. Its books were stacked along the walls, most of them about architecture and irrigation. This wasn't a rebel's home. It was the home of a man who once believed the world could be shaped by logic. You found the letter inside his writing box. It was addressed to no one. It read, "If they come for me, I will not run, okay? But I pray they look at my daughter and see that my hands once planted trees, not daggers." You didn't take the letter. You left. You walked to the hills outside the city and buried the blade beneath a thorn bush. Then you returned to the city. 3 more days passed, and on the 7th day, you returned to the paper shop. This time, you entered as a customer. Masra looked up. For a moment, he seemed to sense something. It's not danger, just a vibration in the world. It's like a thread being tugged at its frayed end. He asked you what you wanted. You said something smooth for a letter. He gave you 3 sheets. You paid in silence. As you turned to leave, he said quietly, "You're not from here." You nodded. "I was once, a long time ago." Then you walked away. That night, you didn't sleep. You wrote a note, folded it 4 times, left it inside the hollow of a tree just outside the old watchtower on the road to Kasvin. You waited 3 days. No one came. On the 4th night, there was a figure at the tree. Khasha. He didn't speak. He retrieved the note, read it, burned it, then walked away. You followed, back to the mountain, back to the fortress that had no name. When you returned, no one greeted you. You slept for 3 nights before anyone summoned you. It was the Imam himself, not the ruler of Persia, not the Caliph, but the shadow behind the curtain. The man whose smile could authorize chaos. The one whose word you were supposed to obey without doubt. He sat in a room full of nothing, no guards, no furniture, just a window with no glass. He asked you only one question. Why didn't you complete the task? You said. He was no longer the threat. He stared at you. His eyes were deep, not cruel, but infinite. And what if you are wrong? You replied, then I will return. He smiled, then said, you already have. You were not punished, you were not praised, but that week, your meals were no longer taken in the hall with the other trainees. They were left beside your door, still warm. Always on time. Kashar never returned. You understood. The final stage of training was solitude. From then on, you taught others, quietly, slowly, like the mountain itself. Sometimes you remembered the girl singing in the courtyard. Sometimes you remembered the weight of that unused blade. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the fortress was asleep and even the goats had fallen silent, you asked yourself, did mercy make me weaker? Or did it make the fortress stronger? You never knew the answer, but you taught the question. And maybe that was the point. Asterisk, in the highlands of northern Hanshu, where the trees whisper before the wind moves and moss covers the stones like memory, there once lived a kind of man who did not belong to the world below. They were called Yamabushi, those who lie down in the mountains, part monk, part mystic, part weapon. By the time you were 12, you had already lived 3 lives. Your parents were villagers, simple rice planters in a province ruled by men who rarely left their fortified keeps. Your father was taken for war tax, one word dragged, off with other strong men to join a distant lord's militia. Your mother died 2 years later, her body thin, her hands hard as bark. After that, the village elder sent you away. Not out of cruelty, but because there was no rice left to share. You were taken by a man with a straw hat, a crooked leg, and a staff taller than he was. He spoke little. He called himself Kozin, but told you that name was not his. It is only what I wear when I walk, he said. The journey began at dusk. He made you walk barefoot, not as punishment, but as tradition. The feet must remember, he said. You didn't ask what they must remember. You were still too cold to ask asterisk. You crossed streams that hissed like boiling kettles in the early fog, climbed ridges where snow still clung in quiet pockets, slept beneath rock ledges where wolves howled, not at the moon, but at silence. By the 3rd day, you had not eaten anything but mountain roots and a dry rice ball given on the first night. Still, your legs moved. Your thoughts slowed, and then the forest thickened. The pine trees grew taller, the light thinner. You could no longer tell whether it was morning or afternoon, only that your breathing felt different, lighter, sharper. You passed through a stone gate covered in ivy and lichen. No words, no carvings. On the other side, the temple was not a building. It was the forest itself. That was when you began your life as a Yamabushi initiate. No one welcomed you. Asterisk, instead. Kozin handed you a thin reed mat, a pair of straw sandals, and a robe dyed in earth. You were told to build your own shelter away from others, but not so far that you couldn't hear the morning bell. There was no hierarchy among the initiates. No names, either. You were all called Sankey pilgrims. It didn't matter where you had come from, only how long you could remain seen. Your first lesson came in the form of nothing. A day passed, then 2, then 5. No one spoke to you. No orders, no tasks, just the forest, the cold, and the hunger. You watched the others. They moved slowly. One gathered moss each morning and wrung it into a bowl to drink. Another sat for hours in the river, motionless, even as the snowmelt water bit at his skin like knives. A third carved lines into the dirt with a stick, repeating the same spiral pattern again and again. You tried the same. You failed. Then you heard the first sound from a Yamabushi elder. It wasn't a chant, not a sermon. It's a whisper. Stillness is louder than movement. You began to understand. The training was not meant to teach skill. It was meant to remove everything that blocked you from seeing on your seventh day. You were asked to carry a bucket of water from the stream to the hilltop shrine. Nothing more, but the bucket had a hole. You made the trip. The bucket emptied itself. Along the way, you returned another hole, another climb. You did this until your feet blistered, till your hands bled from holding the rough rope handle. Only after the 12th trip did you realize the bucket was supposed to leak. You were not meant to succeed. You were meant to understand what effort without attachment felt like. The next morning, Day gave you rice. It was the first warm meal in over a week. No one said a word. From then on, training became visible. Never explained, you learned to strike with a wooden staff butt, not to hurt. To balance a single egg on the back of your hand while meditating under a waterfall. To memorize a page of a sutra while holding a mouthful of water and to recite it without swallowing. You've learned the art of shugo, austere discipline. Done not to master others, but to unmake yourself. One lesson involved walking backward through the forest, blindfolded, while listening only to the sound of birds. You were told, when the birds stop, so should you. It was how they taught you to sense danger through the absence of sound, not the presence of it. Then came the nights in the Okugakure, deep trails where no paths existed. You were given no fire, just a bamboo flute. You were to walk for 2 days without rest, playing one note at every turn to announce your presence to the spirits on your second journey. You met a man dressed in black, hooded, his eyes barely visible. He asked you one question. If your master were to betray his vows, would you silence him? You did not answer. You simply played the flute, one note, low, and walked past him when you returned. Nothing had changed, but your breath was slower. Your shoulders relaxed. Your body had learned not only how to act, but how not to. It was said that Yamabushi assassins never killed out of hate, never out of anger. They killed because the world was out of balance, and the strike of it came was a form of realignment, like trimming a tree, not chopping it down. And then came the night of fire. A temple bell rang at midnight. You and 6 other Senki were summoned to the ridge above the valley. There, a fire burned in a ring. The elders stood inside, chanting something, low and ancient. Each of you was given a wooden blade. The firelight made your shadows dance like spirits. The elder asked, "Will you kill the self that clings?" You were to respond with action. Some broke their blade. Some placed it into the fire. You stood in silence, okay, and dropped it behind you. The elder smiled. Good. The blade is still near, but the self has stepped forward by dawn. You are no longer Senki. You are now Yamabito, a mountain person, and your path would no longer be lit by torches, but by fog and moss and memory. Yet even as you trained among monks and sages, a thought remained in the back of your mind. If the time ever came, would your strike bring balance, or would it simply bring silence? Asterisk, the mountains did not celebrate your passage from Senki to Yamabito. The trees did not move. The river did not sink. But the silence around you deepened. This was how you knew you had changed. The blade you had abandoned in fire was later returned, not as a weapon, but as a riddle. Its wooden edges had charred, but it had not fully burned. It was placed on your mat, accompanied by a single strand of silk. No words, no explanation. You understood. The blade had survived the fire, as you had. The silk was for binding not others, but yourself. You were to wrap the hilt and carry it. So a reminder that all things must pass through heat, and not all things emerge as they began. From now on, K, your tasks involved both the mountain and the world beyond it. Each morning began before light. You would wake to the smell of pine resin and old straw, gather water from the stream, and recite sutras facing a tree older than your memory. The practice wasn't for discipline alone, it was to teach rhythm, because all things life, death, breath, silence have rhythm, and the assassin who cannot move in time with the world is already dead. Your elders began to speak more openly, but only in questions. If a man sleeps peacefully in a house he stole, has he earned the peace? The Lord feeds the hungry, but kills his brother. Is he good or bad? If the balance of the world depends on silence, how loud is a heartbeat? These were not riddles. They were tests. Mental blades meant to carve away your certainty. You learned to sit in the cold for hours until your breath made no cloud. You walked barefoot, crossed stones sharpened by centuries of snowmelt, until your soles no longer bled. But the most difficult trial came not from the mountain, but from the smoke. It was called Enemy No Hide the Day of Smoke. On that day, the oldest Yamabushi took you into a grove where cedar trees grew so tightly you could not see the sky. There they burned herbs not to heal, but to open your mind. Mugwort, pine sap, crushed mushroom caps. The smoke curled thick and green. You sat in the center, eyes closed. You were told, what you see, you must walk through. What you fear, you must name. What you feel, you must leave behind. Then the elder walked away. The smoke thickened, and the memories returned, not just of your parents or your village, but of moments too small to matter to anyone but you. The way your mother folded her sleeves before kneeling, the color of your father's neck after hours in the sun, the mud under your fingernails as you clutched your first handful of rice. As a child, they rose in the smoke, and then so did your doubts. What if you were never meant to be here? What if the balance the Yamabushi spoke of was just a story? What if all of this claiming through fog, bathing in ice, silence as a weapon was simply a way to forget? You wanted to leave. Your body, T-E-N-S-E-D. But then, something else arrived. Not a memory, not a presence. You felt watched, not by the elders, not by animals, but by the mountain itself. It was not kind, was not cruel. It simply was. And in that moment, something shifted in you. You let go. You exhaled, and the smoke cleared when you opened your eyes. The sun had moved halfway across the sky. A crow sat watching you from a branch. His feathers were the color of ink left too long in the well dot you stood, and the crow did not fly away that night. No one asked what you had seen, but your teacher Kozen, who had once found you in rags, left a scroll on your mat. It was blank. You understood? Some things are not to be written. The next season. A storm came. Wind cracked trees at their base. Rain turned paths into rivers. 2 Yamabito were injured when a boulder crushed their meditation shelter. You helped dig them out. You used your staff as a brace, your robe as a sling, and for the first time since arriving, were spoken to by name. Not the name you were born with, the one the mountain gave you. Shika. Dear, swift, silent, watchful. It was a gift, and it was your burden, because now you could be sent down from the mountain to restore balance, to silence what had grown too loud. 1 moon later, you were sent on your first real task. Not an assassination, a judgment. You were told of a village lord in the southern valleys. He had begun collecting land from the elderly, quietly, legally, but cruelly. No bloodshed, only contracts and shame. The people had prayed to the mountain. The mountain had listened. You were chosen. They gave you no blade, just your robe, your staff, and 3 rice cakes for the journey. You traveled alone. When you arrived, the village was celebrating a harvest. Lanterns floated in the pond. Children played in straw. But beneath it all, there was a tightness like a drumskin stretched too far. You stayed with a retired washerwoman. She gave you soup. You gave her silence. You observed, and you waited. The Lord never left his home. But each morning, he sent out men to gather news, to collect payments, to inspect landmarkers. His methods were surgical. He never threatened. He never forced. He only watched. And in watching, he swallowed the village. You left a message for him, written in water on a rice paper fan. When the mountain sends mist, it is not always for beauty. You placed it on his gate. He read it and invited you in. He offered tea. You sat in silence. He asked who you were. You said, "I am a reflection." He said, "Then I have nothing to fear." You said, "Reflections reveal what is already there." He did not respond, but he poured you another cup that night. Dismissed as men the next morning. So we returned to parcels of land to their owners. No one thanked you. No one needed to. You had not struck, but something had changed. The mountain did not demand blood, only balance. And so you returned. Kozan met you at the gate. He asked, "Was justice served?" You said nothing. You only bowed, and in the quiet of that moment, even the birds stopped singing. But in the back of your mind, the question remained. If justice and silence share a face, how will you know when to speak? The mist returned 3 days after your journey, thick and low. Like breath held too long, it curled over the temple steps and coiled through the cedar trees, as if the mountain had chosen to vanish itself from the world for a little while. And in that mist, the Yamabushi gathered, not to speak, but to listen. It was Jukai, no Yuruth, night of vows. You sat in a circle with 7 others, each robed in the faded grays of the mountain. Ildas moved between you like shadows, placing a single item before each initiate: a bowl of snow, a thread of silk, a charred stick, a lock of hair, a shard of obsidian, a feather, a mirrored dot in front of you, a worn sandal. You understood? The sandal symbolized journey, not just yours, but others. The vow you were about to take was not for yourself. It was to ensure the path for others remained open. Kozan stood at the edge of the circle. This time, he held no staff. He said, "The mountain gives, the mountain takes." The Yamabushi must know when to become mist and when to become stone. Then he vanished into the forest without a sound. That was his final lesson to you, and his final presence. He would not return. Yamabushi do not die in ceremony. They leave as they arrive in silence. After Jukai, the mountain changed. Or perhaps it was you. You were now permitted into the Oku, the inner path, where only fully initiated Yamabushi walked. These trails wound around cliffs no one else dared to step across. Here, you studied the Shigendo scrolls, filled not with techniques, but stories long. Winding stories about monks who became wind, about spirits who could only be seen by those who had abandoned fear. They were not meant to be believed. They were meant to be carried. That winter, a message arrived, delivered not by a man, but by a folded crane-reel feathers, but hollow inside, sealed with wax dot inside. A single line. A strike was made. The balance did not return. You knew what it meant. A Yamabushi had taken a life. And still, the world had remained tilted. You were to investigate, not to judge, not to avenge, simply to understand. This time, the journey was long. South, past the mountain ridges, and toward the coast. To a village on the edge of the forest, where waves struck stone like drums. There, you found the traces. A man had been killed, a Lord Steward, poisoned with monkshood in his evening tea. No blood, no struggle, and yet the people had not rejoiced. They whispered. They avoided the temple. Its children no longer played in the shrine's garden. The silence was not peace. It was mourning. You stayed for 7 days. You spoke to no one. On the 8th day, girl brought you dried persimmons and bowed. You asked her only one thing. Was your village more silent before or after a tea? She did not answer with words. She pointed to the bell tower. Its rope had been cut. You climbed to the tower that evening there. Neath the bell, you found an offering, a Yamabushi sash, burned at one end, a sign of exile. The one who had killed had judged alone and had found his act unworthy. You left your staff beside it, not as a condemnation, but as a promise that silence would return, not forced. When you returned to the mountain, it was spring. Snow had retreated into the peaks. The river ran fast, and the trees bore their first new needles. You resumed your place among the Yamabito, but something had changed. Not around you, within you. You no longer moved like a boy sent to survive. You moved like part of the mountain itself. When disputes came, the elders sent others, but when quiet broke, they sent you to walk, to listen, to wait, and once to sit in a courtroom in Kyoto, unnoticed, while an imperial advisor delivered a speech full of half-truths. You said nothing, but your silence filled the space behind. His words like a shadow at noon. He stepped down, sweating. Later, he retired. No explanation, no confrontation, just balance. Years passed. You trained others. You watched children from broken homes arrive. As you once had frightened, hollow, desperate for purpose, you taught them how to breathe before speaking, how to kneel before questioning, how to hear the rhythm of the trees. But not all stayed. Some left before the first winter. Some stayed too long and never returned from the mist. You mourned none, not out of coldness, out of understanding, because the path was not meant for all. The mountain was not a destination, it's a process. One spring, an old man arrived. No robe, no staff, just a flute, and a face you remembered only by the lines around. His mouth, he played a single note, and vanished. You understood. Kozan had returned, not in form, but in motion, and you knew what had to come next. One final journey, not to kill, not to judge, but to disappear. You left the fortress that summer, walked into the forest without direction. You left your name folded in paper beneath the old cedar tree. It read, "When the wind carries no sound, listen deeper." No one followed. No one needed to, because your footsteps had already taught them everything. And in the far corners of Japan, when people feel peace, return to a place where pain once ruled, they do not thank kings or gods. They say, the mountain sent someone. But no one ever sees them, because sometimes the sharpest blade is the one that remains sheathed. Asterisk, Baghdad, in the 9th century, was not simply a city. It was the pulse of the world, rising from the banks of the Tigris, like a vision stitched from gold and ash. It's the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was a place where philosophers and poisoners walked the same streets. And the most dangerous ideas were not shouted, but whispered. The House of Wisdom had already changed the world. Scholars translated Aristotle into Arabic by lamplight, while couriers from Bukhara to Cairo brought strange devices, strange cures, and stranger truths. Spices, silks, coups passed hands in courtyards that smelled of cardamom and secrets. But in the shadows of this glittering city, another institution grew, quieter, older, more precise. Some called it Beit al-Samtha, House of Silence. It did not exist officially. It had no marked doors, no signs, and it moved through Baghdad like smoke through the latticeworks, seeping into places even fire dared not touch. And you at 12 were brought into it, not by choice, but by debt. Your father was a translator, or had been before. He was arrested for rendering a banned Persian text into Arabic. Something about destiny or disobedience. You weren't told. You only remembered the ink on his fingers and the look in his eyes when they took him away. Not fear, it's apology. You and your mother were left with nothing. She sold sweetbread near the gates of the round city, sometimes with enough flour, sometimes without. You stopped going to the mosque, not out of rebellion, but out of hunger. Then came to be a thin man with eyes like oil and fingers that never stopped moving. He wore the garb of a bookseller, but no one ever saw him carry books. He watched you for 3 days. On the 4th, he spoke. I saw you steal that fig without moving your feet. You froze. He smiled. I'd like to show you something. A tea. Didn't ask your mother. He didn't need to. He left her a pouch of coins, enough for a year, maybe 2, and then he took you into the park, quarter across narrow bridges, through spice markets, and down a staircase hidden behind a door carved to look like a wall. It was dark, not candle dark, earth-dark below the streets. The air smelled of oil and vinegar and old parchment. There were no names, just the scribes. That was what they called themselves, but they did not write. Not really. They copied maps of the city with invisible ink. They tested poisons in clay cups and timed how long each heartbeat could hold out. They studied the patterns of the guards near the caliph's private library, not to break in, but to know who else might want to. They were watchers, listeners, and sometimes silencers. You were not told what you were learning. At first, it felt like nothing. They gave you riddles and puzzles and instructed you to sit in complete stillness while flies landed on your face. If you swatted, you failed. If you fell asleep, you started over. One test involved being locked in a windowless room with a single candle and a cat. You were to observe the flame, it's nothing else. When the door opened 4 hours later, you were asked, what color were the cat's eyes when it blinked? You had not looked at the cat. You failed, but the next day, they asked you again. They were teaching you split perceptions, the art of watching without appearing to, the art of feeling a room, not just seeing it. And slowly, the silence began to speak. You learned how to walk without raising dust, how to eavesdrop on 2 conversations at once, and remember both, how to trace the route of a diplomat through the souk by the pressure, his sandals left in the dirt. But most importantly, you learned how to disappear, not just from sight, but from record. Your name was erased from the mosque register. Your mother moved away. The neighbors no longer remembered your face. One day, a child pointed at you in the street and said, "That's the fig thief." But his mother frowned and replied, "No, dear, he's no one." And that was the highest compliment the scribes could give. At 13, they tested you. You were sent to deliver a message, not on paper, okay? With breath. You were taught a whispered language, 10 syllables, 6 tones. A phrase that, when said a certain way, signaled the fall of a merchant in Samara. The whisper had to pass through 3 people before it reached the ears of the intended listener. You were the first link. You whispered into the ear of a seller of ink. She whispered to a barber. The barber whispered to a tea boy, and the tea boy was never seen again. A week later, the merchant in Samara was found poisoned, but no one remembered who had said. What? Not even you. That was the point. Words were blades, and yours had been sharp. Later, a bee called you into the archive room. It was a chamber with no shelves, just scrolls hung from hooks like sleeping birds. He lit a lantern and unrolled a scroll without reading it. Do you know the story of the man who never blinked? He asked. You shook your head. He was the caliph's favorite bodyguard. He stood so still that the pigeons landed on him. One day, a girl walked past, selling oranges. She tripped, and he blinked. And that was how the caliph died. You stared. He smiled. It's not always the blade that kills. Sometimes it's the eye that opens. That night, you were given your first dagger, slim, curved, with a hilt wrapped in cloths, soaked in vinegar, coot, to prevent slipping. You didn't ask what you were to do with it. You only asked, whose silence must I protect? And that was when Nabi said, that's the wrong question. He turned, rolled the scroll shut, blew out the lantern, and in the dark, he whispered, ask, instead, who must remain heard. Because sometimes the silence is a lie, and sometimes it's the whispers. The only truth left, by the time you were 14, Baghdad no longer seemed large. You had mapped it without ink, walked it without leaving footprints, listened to it without ever asking a single question aloud. You had come to understand the city the way an apothecary understands pain, not as something to be cured, but something to be understood before it spreads. The house of silence, your home beneath the carporter, was now a part of your breath. You moved within it, not as a student, but as a thread in a larger weave. You had no name, but you had weight, a presence that made the oil lamps flicker slightly when you passed. It was during the month of Safar that you were summoned by Rackham, the man whose face was always partially hidden by a thin silk veil. No one knew where he had come from. He had no accent. His hands bore no calluses. Yet when he entered the chamber, even Nabi bowed. Rackham spoke rarely, but when he did, each word seemed to have been distilled from 10 unsaid truths. He did not ask questions. He gave statements. You have been seen, he told you, not by a guard, not by a spy, but by a scribe of the caliph himself. A girl no older than you. She had noticed something, a gesture, perhaps, a step out of rhythm, a word you whispered too gently. Something had broken the veil, and now her eyes were following the pattern behind the curtain. Your task, Rackham said, was not to silence her, but to watch her, to understand her, because if she could see you, she could see others, and that made her dangerous. Her name was Zainab bint Yusuf. She worked in the Caliph's palace archives, cataloging correspondence and double-checking transcripts of debates in the Majlis. She was known for her quiet corrections, the way she would slide a revised passage into a stack without drawing attention. She never raised her voice, never walked fast, but her memory was absolute. You began your surveillance the next day. You pretended to be a page boy, tasked with collecting refuse from the scriptorium. Your robes were dusted, your eyes cast downward. You entered without drawing eyes, except hers. She looked at you once, only once, but you felt it. Not suspicion, recognition. For 2 weeks, you followed her from shadow to shadow, through the tiled courtyards of the Beit al-Hikmah, across the garden paths where cats slept beside calligraphers, down to the archive vaults where even the air seemed to hold its breath. She spoke to no one about you, but one night, after the candles had been extinguished, you found a folded piece of paper beneath the bench where she usually sat. No name, just a sentence. If you were here to kill me, do it well. I have copied every name I saw. You brought the note to Nabih. He read it, folded it, burned it. Then he looked at you and asked, and what do you think she copied? You said nothing, because you understood. She had seen more than your face. She had seen the outline of the house itself, its methods, its purpose, its soft knives and hidden mouths, and she was not afraid. That was the real danger. A week passed. Then Rackham summoned you again. This time, the instructions were simple. Test her, not by combat, by philosophy, by contradiction, by pressure. So, the next day, you approached her in the courtyard, disguised as a scholar's assistant. You carried a bundle of books and dropped one intentionally at her feet. As she handed it back, you said, "Do you believe in absolute truth?" She raised her eyes, but only slightly, then said, "No, I believe in traceable patterns." That evening, you reported her answer. Rackham nodded. "Double quotes, then give her a lie," he said. "Can't watch how she traces it." Okay. The lie was a planted letter, written in the caliph's own hand, or at least a perfect replica. It hinted at a plan to discredit one of his most loyal governors. A trap, a fabrication, slipped quietly into the scrolls she was transcribing. If she followed the path, she would eventually encounter names and networks that did not exist. Phantoms of the house's design. She would be chasing whispers. The following morning, you watched her read it. She did not react, not immediately, but the next day. She requested access to 3 old transcripts from a region that hadn't been discussed in years. The day after that, she requested a sealed document. By the 4th day, she was no longer tracing the lie. She was editing it, strengthening it, making it harder to detect. You returned to Rackham. She knew, you said. She improved it, he replied. And that's when the decision was made, not to remove her, to invite her. Rare act. The House of Silence did not recruit. It absorbed. You were the emissary. You left a scroll at her sleeping quarters, written in lemon ink, visible only when warmed near flame. It said, "You see what others do not. Come and learn why they cannot." She came, not immediately, but on the 7th night, just before the moon turned full. She walked into the old hammam, near the Kark Quarter abandoned for years, but still echoing with heatless steam. "You waited," she said. "What happens if I say no?" You replied, "Then we both disappear." She did not flinch. "Fine," she said, "but I keep copying, always." And you nodded, because even within the silence, some voices must remain. From that day, Snab bint Yusuf became part of the house. But she changed it. She built a system for tracking not just enemies, but errors, patterns in speech, slips in, forgery, overused codes. She showed you how language itself could be turned into a kind of fingerprint, and you, who had once been sent to erase her, now followed her lead. Years passed. You worked together in the spaces between thought and sound, and though her name would never appear in a book, and yours had been forgotten long ago, those who tried to disrupt the city's delicate balance began to vanish faster than ever. Before, not from the blade, from the whisper, but deep down, a question lingered, one that neither you nor she ever voiced. If we are the silence that protects the world, who protects the world from us? Asterisk, by the time you were 15. Your face no longer belonged to you. The city still moved around you, lanterns swinging above alleys, poets disputing metaphors beside canals, pigeons scattering from rooftops where oil lamps flickered into dawnbud. You were no longer of Baghdad. You were beneath it. You had become a listener others didn't know they were speaking to, a memory others forgot they had met. You'd mastered the sound of sandal against wet stone, the rhythm of lies spoken in polite Arabic, the distinction between letters inked with fear and those composed in calm deception. Zainab, once the girl who nearly exposed the house, was now your equal. Some whispered she had surpassed you. Her mind was different. She didn't wield information like a blade. She dissolved it. She could take a name, a rumor, a proverb, and trace it back to the moment it first took breath, and then quietly suffocated. With silence, it was she who discovered the breach. The house had always assumed it was impenetrable, but Zainab found a pattern. Courier logs repeating the same delivery path to precisely, quote, a map in the palace with marginalia that didn't match the cartographer's ink. A servant who asked about the tea schedule twice in the same day. She traced the breach to a scholar named Harun Altafel, a historian employed by the palace to record debates between imams and mathematicians. On the surface, he was forgettable, dusty, hunched, overfond of fig wine. But Zainab noticed that his records were too accurate. No scholar in Baghdad, no matter how precise, could capture exactly what was said, how it was said, and what was not said in a single scroll. Harun, it seemed, had been trained, not by the house, by someone else. Someone older. Rackham was troubled. He summoned you both. His face, always veiled, was drawn with silence, thicker than usual. He held a scroll bound with red thread. The breach is not from outside, he said. It's from before. Zainab narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Rackham paused before the house of silence. There was another. You and Zainab exchanged a glance. The house was not the first whisper, Rackham continued. Only the best hidden. Then he unrolled the scroll. It was a diagram, simple, yet terrifying at the center. A mark you did not recognize, circular, etched with curling lines, like smoke trapped in a jar. Around it were names you did recognize, poets who had died mysteriously, merchants whose deaths were blamed on sudden illness, one or two caliphs officially victims of fatigue or the will of God, all connected by this symbol, asterisk. It's called Al-Qadam, Al-Qadima, Rackham said. The fading step. Another order, Zainab asked. Rackham nodded once. Older than the caliphate, older than ink. It was not just another house. It was the one that built the first, and it had returned. You were tasked with finding Harun, not to silence him, to follow him back. For 6 days, you shadowed him through the narrowest parts of Baghdad's the pigeon markets, the spice alleys, the doorways that led to courtyards that led to other cities. He spoke to no one. He transcribed daily, but every evening he visited the same place, an abandoned bathhouse on the edge of the canal, where no water flowed anymore. You waited on the 7th night. He entered the bathhouse before the sun had set. You followed, but you weren't alone inside. The air was heavy with rosewater and rust, and there, beyond the veil of steam, sat a man with no shadow. He wore white. His face was plain, too plain, the kind of face you forget the moment you turn away. He looked at you and said your name, not your birth name, not the one the house had given you, the true one. Then he said, your house has been guarding a door without knowing what lies behind it. You stepped back, reached for your blade, but the man in white raised his hand, not to strike Dot, to offer a scroll, sealed with wax, stamped with the symbol you had seen on Rackham's parchment. You took it. You left. You never found Harun again. The bathhouse burned the next morning. No bodies were found. Back at the house, you unsealed the scroll. Zainab read it beside you. It was not a threat. It was not a plan. It was a confession. Inside were lists of agents the fading step had embedded in every major city, Cordoba, Cairo, Nayshaper, even Chiang. Most were retired. Some didn't know they had been trained. And at the bottom of the scroll, we no longer control the silence. It controls us. Rackham read it and disappeared. No farewell, no trace. He was gone, and the house of silence changed. Zainab took leadership quietly, efficiently. She shifted its purpose, no longer to erase, but to record, to become what the Reek house feared most, a witness. You followed her, not because she commanded, but because she had seen the thread before it frayed. Under her watch, the house became a net. It let the noise pass, but caught the patterns, and when needed, just when balance tipped too far the whisper, blades moved again, only when necessary, only when the silence begged for release. You still carried the blade a bee once gave you, but now it sleeps, because sometimes the sharpest blade is the one that waits. And in a city where the noise of power grows ever louder, the greatest danger is not being heard, it's being understood. Asterisk in the 14th century, Venice did not sleep by day. Its canals gleamed with the pride of 100 merchant empires. Flags from Alexandria, Constantinople, and Bruges flapped in the sea wind, and traders shouted in 5 tongues before breakfast. But by night, the city became something else. The water grew quiet, the bells stopped, and the masks came out. Masks were part of the culture, worn during festivals, sure, but also during secret meetings, quiet crimes, and court intrigues. In Venice, a mask wasn't a disguise. It was a permission slip, and that's why the Guild of Shadows existed. They didn't call themselves assassins. That was a term for the East, clumsy, exotic, soaked in blood. The guild had other names. Sushari, they were sometimes called. The Whispers. They didn't strike with daggers. They persuaded with fear. They didn't remove enemies. They erased their usefulness, and that's why they noticed you. You were a boy of 13, born behind the glass furnaces of Murano, where the heat from the kilns made your skin thick before your voice even cracked. Your father blew glass for the Doge's feasts. Your mother died of fever before you could. Remember her face? You worked the bellows until your hands cracked. But in the evenings, after the heat faded and the apprentices drank themselves into sleep, you wandered, not from mischief, for silence. You liked to watch. You stood by the bridge near the Campo San Polo and counted which noblemen arrived without retinues. You memorized the patterns of light that leaked from the windows of the Council of Ten. You listened to gondoliers complain about routes, and learned where the richest men preferred to be robbed. And one night, as you leaned against the stone of a quiet alley, you watched a man fall. He didn't scream. He simply crumpled. No blood. No sound. A figure walked past him, smooth, cloaked, a mask with only a single slit across the eyes. You did not run. You followed. He led you nowhere. But the next morning, a coin appeared beneath your pillow. A real coin, florin gilded, untraceable, and a message carved faintly into the wall behind your cot. Come to the basilica after the 3rd bell. Bring nothing. You obeyed. In Venice, it was safer to obey silence than to question gold at the basilica. You found no one, just the pigeons, and a boy your age, dressed as a novice monk. He handed you a folded piece of parchment. No seal, just an address near the E. Ghetto Vecchio, where the air always smelled like tallow and fish bones. You went. The building was abandoned, but the 3rd step creaked 3 times when you pressed it. That was the signal. Inside, the room was dim. A single candle, and a woman with gloves. No visible blade. No name. She asked, "How long do you plan to keep pretending to be normal?" You said nothing. She smiled. "Good. You're hired." No ceremony, no oath. The Guild of Shadows did not require loyalty, only discipline. Your first task was to shadow. Gondolier suspected of helping smugglers, not to confront, not to accuse, just to make him feel watched. For 5 nights. You did just that. You never touched him, but once. You whistled the tune his mother used to hum. It's loud enough that he heard it in the fog. He reported himself to the Doge the next day. Confessed to a crime he hadn't yet committed. And the guild sent you a loaf of sweet bread and a new pair of shoes. You were learning in the guild. Okay? Job well done meant the world became quieter. Your second task was harder. A painter. Popular. Talkative. Too. Popular, he painted things he shouldn't have seen. Men with robes too dark. Ships arriving at hours when docks should have been closed. He placed these things in the corners of his work, thinking no one would notice. The guild noticed. You were told to alter his next commission, not the painting, the pigment. So you learned to grind powdered lead. You swapped it into his blues and purples while he slept. His workshop left conveniently, unlocked by someone else. Weeks passed. Then came the shakes, the loss of memory, the babbling. he began to forget names, places, ideas. One day, he painted a door over a door and didn't understand why it wouldn't open. No one killed him. No one touched him. But the whispers stopped. You advanced. Your training became deeper. They taught you the art of masking tone. How to sound like an honest man when asking a question no honest man should ask. They taught you to poison bread with intention, not bitterness. To write anonymous letters with poor grammar on purpose, to throw off suspicion, to pick locks, not to open doors, but to make others think they had forgotten to lock them. It wasn't about chaos, it was about doubt. The guild believed that doubt was the most powerful poison of all. You were 15 when they gave you your first full mask. White, featureless, they said. Wear it once, then destroy it. No mask should know 2 days. It felt strange, putting it on. But once you did, understood, people told the truth to masks, because they could pretend no one was listening. And one night, a cardinal whispered a secret to you. In a confessional, thinking you were a priest. You said nothing. But the next day, its letter to the Pope never arrived. The guild had intercepted it, all because of your silence. Venice kept turning. The gold kept moving. The guild thrived. But something gnawed at you. Not guilt, not fear. Certainty. You knew you were good, too good. And that meant, one day, you would be asked to choose. Not between right and wrong, but between silence and the truth. And the question began to haunt you. If masks protect the truth, who protects us from the mask? It's asterisk. By your 16th year, Q had become a name no one said. Not because they didn't know it, but because, even speaking, it felt risky. In Venice, rumors were the river that flowed faster than water, and the Guild of Shadows ensured that your name became part of the city's foundation, unseen, but holding weight. You no longer walked the alleys. You glided through them. He knew which stones creaked underfoot, which shutters clicked open during confession hour, which gondolas didn't belong to their rowers. The guild had given you tools, not daggers, but truths and masks, always masks. Your current assignment was different. The target wasn't a man. It wasn't even a betrayal. It was an idea Venice was preparing for. Carnival, a time when the city disguised itself entirely. Rich and poor wore the same faces. Servants walked beside senators. Lovers passed their rivals without flinching. Secrets real. Ones flourished like mold in the damp brick. The Council of 10 had grown uneasy. Asterisk. Too many foreign coins. Too many unfamiliar dances. A whisper had reached them. A diplomat from Milan, staying under another name, was meeting with someone high in the Venetian courts. The guild was tasked not with stopping the meeting, but with learning what the meeting meant. Not what was said, not who said it, but what would follow. You were paired with an older agent named Giovanni, whose silence spoke louder than his footsteps. His face was lined, but not tired. He wore no mask. That made him more frightening. Only someone who could erase others had the confidence to walk exposed. Together, you posed as merchants from Naples. Asterisk. You rented a canal front room in Dorso Duro, across from a merchant house that had been temporarily abandoned by its owners. Fiction arranged by the guild. The diplomat, traveling as Sergio di Mare, was predictable. He took the same gondola, from the same dock every afternoon. You didn't intercept him. You intercepted the dock worker who tied the gondola, a man who was in love with his own reflection. Easy to bribe, easier to forget. You had him loosen the ropes one day, just enough that the gondola floated downriver 5 minutes too soon. The diplomat panicked. He took a new gondola in a rush, and in doing so, took a different route, through your canal, and past your open window, where Giovanni waited with a painter's easel. He sketched the man's profile, and seconds later, the guild scribes matched it to a Milanese general. Not a diplomat, an imposter, a military man posing as a merchant. using Carnival as cover. That changed the assignment. You were now not just observing, you were to intervene, but subtly. The guild didn't assassinate generals in costumes. It unraveled their intent. The target's plan was simple. He aimed to meet a noblewoman from the council's extended familia, widow, known for her opinions and her fortune. He hoped to gain favor through flattery, perhaps secure a marriage proposal, or at least a scandal. You couldn't kill the man, but you could make him question what was real. So you changed the script. You disguised yourself as a servant, Boyan, the household where the meeting was to take place. You replaced the general's gifted bottle of Amarant with a bitter blend of wormwood and crushed violets non-lethal, but enough to alter his mood. You replaced the petals in the widow's wine, bath with wild herbs that caused skin to redden. You hired 3 children to follow the man around Venice, saying nothing, just playing the same tune on reed pipes until he told them to stop. He grew irritable, paranoid, and by the time the night of the meeting arrived, he was late, agitated, and visibly sweating. You were waiting outside the villa in a mask of bone white, shaped like a plague doctor's. Keek, he saw you, only once, but that was enough. He canceled the meeting. He returned to his inn and was on a boat to Kiwa by dawn. The guild never confronted him because there was no need. He would report to Milan that Venice was unpredictable, dangerous, not worth the risk. Victory, quiet, complete, but something else had happened during the operation. You had been seen, not by the target, by someone else, a mask maker. She operated near the Ponte dell'Accademia. You passed her stall 100 times, but this time she looked at you as you walked by in costume and said, "That mask doesn't match your eyes." You froze, not because you feared exposure, because you feared recognition. No one was supposed to see you anymore, but this woman no older than 30, with soot on her hands and peacock feathers at her stall, looked through you. You walked away, but the next morning, a new mask appeared at your door. No note, no ribbon, just a mask half white, half deep obsidian, painted with a single teardrop beneath the left eye. It wasn't decorative, it was a message. Someone knew who you were, not by name, but by intent. You brought the mask to Giovanni. He stared at it for a long time, then said, "Do nothing." He asked, "What if she talks?" He replied, "If she knew what she had seen, she wouldn't be here." Okay, but he was wrong. 3 nights later, her stall was gone. Not burned, not robbed. Gone, clean, like she had never existed. And that's when you understood. You had not been protecting Venice. You had been protecting the guild's illusion of Venice in one scene, even by an innocent. The illusion could not risk exposure. You asked no questions. You received no answers. But you stopped sleeping, not out of guilt, out of clarity, because now you knew what the guild feared most. Not betrayal, not failure, recognition. The guild lived in masks because they believed masks kept the truth in check. But what happens when someone sees the face behind the mask and smiles anyway? Asterisk, the mask with the teardrop haunted you, not just because it was beautiful, not just because it appeared without a name, but because it shouldn't have existed. No one left messages from members of the guild. No one dared. And yet, someone had. And, worse, they did it kindly. You spent the following nights retracing your steps. You visited the old stall near Ponte dell'Accademia under 3 different guises. A scholar, a vendor, a noble's assistant. The stall was gone, razed without trace. Other sellers remembered nothing. One said the wind blew too hard that week. Another blamed the flooding. But you knew Venice, and in Venice, the disappeared were not always dead. Sometimes they were made invisible. By force, sometimes by choice. You began to look for her, not to erase her, to understand her. It was the one thing the guild had taught above all else. Understanding came before silence. You recalled her hand stained with ash and lacquer, the faint scent of boiled leather clinging to her sleeves. Her eyes were steady, not wide. She wasn't afraid. When she saw you, that meant she'd seen others, which meant she had history. You went to the archivist in Costello who tracked permits for the mask vendors. Nothing under her stall's name, but there was a permit registered to a Lucretia Serratua name buried in old guild records as both an artist and an orphan from the plague years. Vanished, then reappeared with an entirely new surname a decade later. Her workshop had once been in a crumbling wing of a convent turned dye house. You found it. It was empty, but not abandoned. Inside, the dust was swept, the air clean, its tools arranged. A single brush lay bristled down in a bowl of ochre, and on the wall, faintly scratched, were 3 words. We see you. Not I, we. You backed out slowly, returned to the guild, and made your report. Giovanni listened. He didn't blink when you finished. He exhaled and said, "There is a reason the guild has no windows." You asked, "Because we prefer shadows." He said, "No, because we know someone might be watching." And then, for the first time, he told you a secret. There was another guild once, not in Venice, in Milan, before the wars. For the books were burned. They called themselves Gli Occhi della, not the eyes of the night. They didn't kill, they collected faces, names, silences, kindnesses. They believed some truths were too fragile to be written, so they stored them in memory. Your eyes narrowed, and what happened to them? He said nothing, but the look was enough. Your guild had removed them, all except a few survivors, watchers, people who left teardrop masks, not as threats, but as a promise that someone still remembered the world before fear. Giovanni stood. Your task is done. Forget her. You left. But you didn't forget, because something inside you had shifted. Not loyalty, not skill. Just weight, the kind of weight that comes from knowing your blade might no longer be pointed in the right direction. That night, you visited the Scuola dei Carmini, a forgotten corner of Venice where plague victims were once kept in silence. The bell tower had long since broken, but the staircase remained. You climbed it. You left your mask there bone white, stripped of paint, and in its place, you found something waiting. Another mask, half black, half dashed gold, and this time, 2 teardrops. The message was clear. You were not alone in your questions. There were others, watchers within the watchers, not traitors, preservers, and so you returned to the point. Killed. You resumed your tasks. You fulfilled your roles, but beneath every mask you wore, a second thought now lingered, and with every order given, every silence demanded, every name erased, you asked yourself quietly, what would she have seen in this? And sometimes you chose not to act, and sometimes the city healed itself anyway, because maybe the guild wasn't meant to be feared. Maybe it was meant to be witnessed. And one day, long after you had trained your own replacements, long after your name had been carved and erased 1,000 times, you received one final letter. It contained no words, just a mask. Full gold, no tears, no smile, just eyes, and behind it, a note in her handwriting. Now you see what I saw. Asterisk, the Topkapi Palace was not built for sleep. It breathed through its gardens and marble, through its silence and scent. It echoed with the slippered footsteps of hundreds of pages, scribes, viziers, concubines, cooks, guards, shadows, and behind, all that beyond the gilded gates through the geometric courtyards. Behind the carved lattice stood the harem gate, not a metaphor, an actual gate, stone, iron, always closed, and always watched you at the age of 12. were told never to speak while near it. Even later, long after you'd passed through it hundreds of times, you still never spoke there, because by the time you were allowed near that door, silence had become your only language. You had not been born in the empire. You were brought into it. Your name had been stripped. So had everything else. The surgeon's blade had left no scar, but it had changed everything. You were not a man. You were not a boy. You were not a threat. And in the eyes of the Ottoman court, this made you perfect, a eunuch, one of hundreds. But you were assigned to a path you walked. Harem custodian trainee, not for lust, there was none. Not for power, not yet. Asterisk, but because the Sultan's greatest fears didn't lie on battlefields. They lived behind the harem gate, and they needed watching, not through violence, through presence. Asterisk. You began in the outer court kitchens. You swept. You listened. You studied who came and who left, not by face, but by sound. You memorized the difference between the step of a eunuch and a janissary, between the robes of a concubine and the rustle of a scribe's sleeves. On your third month, you were sent to serve tea in silence to a woman they called the quiet fire one of the Sultan's lesser wives. You poured, you bowed. You didn't look at her, but she spoke. She asked, "Do you see what I see?" You said, "Nothing." She smiled. "Then you'll last." Later that night, your senior custodian told you she had poisoned 3 rivals with crushed apricot pits. You began to understand. The harem was not soft. It was sharper than any sword the empire had ever forged. And your role was not to guard the women. It was to absorb the secrets they could not say aloud. Your training changed. You were assigned to Siladar Mimd, the chief black eunuch. His skin was dark as ink. His voice, a whisper wrapped in velvet, and his stare was said to cause miscarriages. You didn't believe that? But you did believe he could make a man forget his own family name with a single look. He taught you without speaking. He handed you notes with broken sentences. You were to complete them. He showed you letters half burned and asked you to reconstruct their meaning. He walked you past the harem gate every dawn and made you describe what you heard from inside without looking. He once blindfolded you and spun you in a courtyard until the world spun in return. Then he whispered, "Now find the woman who does not want to be found." You found her in the laundry chamber, humming a Greek lullaby out of tune. She was not part of the harem. She was a spy. You never saw her again, and your training continued. You were now trusted with keys, dozens of them, all similar, all real. Only 3 worked. The rest were decoys, meant to test whether you'd noticed which locks mattered. You passed. You learned the code of fan placements. How concubines communicated preference, favor, or jealousy by the tilt of a fan on a silk pillow. You learned how to smell fear in rosewater. You learned which perfumes masked blood. And then you were brought into the midnight registry, a place behind the Sultan's library, accessible only through a secret arch behind a bookshelf carved with Quranic verses. There, under dim lamps and thick rugs, sat scrolls, thousands of them, not poetry, not law, confessions. Every slip of paper written by concubines who feared for their lives. Every accusation, every suspicion, every line of panic written before the morning light could offer protection. You were told to read them all and to remember which ones were never to be spoken of again. One day, you read a name that matched on your birth name, the one taken from you, attached to a woman, your mother. Her confession. She had begged a Venetian merchant to buy her son back from captivity, smuggle him out of the empire. She had failed. That woman was later executed for sedition. The date matched the year. You were brought to Topkapi. You folded the scroll. You burned it, and you said nothing, because you now understood. Your body may have been shaped by the empire, But your silence was yours. It could not be stolen. It could not be bargained. It was your power. The harem gate opened to you that winter, not ceremonially. Someone left it ajar by mistake. You stepped through. The corridor beyond was warm, lit with hanging lamps. Voices echoed but softly, like secrets wrapped in silk. No one stopped you. You passed women playing chess, others reading, one dancing alone to music no one else heard at the far end of the hallway. A girl sat writing. She looked up. She didn't scream. She said, "If you've come to kill me, at least let me finish the sentence." You said nothing. She returned to writing, and you stood there, watching, not because you had orders, but because, for the first time, someone inside the gate had spoken to you as a person, not a pair of eyes, not a function, and you wondered if silence is your strength. What happens when someone listens anyway? Asterisk. Her name was Esma, not a concubine, not a favorite, not a servant, a daughter, not of the Sultan, of one of his brothers exiled, disgraced, and now forgotten. She lived within the harem, not as prisoner, nor pawn, but as a shadow. Said she was kept away from court life, from marriage proposals, from attention. Value was uncertain, too royal to be discarded, too politically awkward to be acknowledged. And so she was left to write. Poetry, mostly. Sometimes letters. None were sent. No one read them until you did. You had not been assigned to her. She had not been assigned to anyone. But she watched you, and she spoke. Not often, not clearly. But when she did, her words wrapped themselves around, the quiet like threads stitched into old silk. Do you know what it means to be erased while breathing? She asked you once. You did not answer, because you did know. Over time, she invited you closer. Never directly. She would leave a folded paper beside the basin in the courtyard where you placed towels. You read them in silence. Always written with care. Always in two languages, Atomin, Turkish, and Greek. Not because she expected you to understand both, but because she did, and that was how her mind made sense of the world. One day, the paper read, "What do eunuchs dream about?" He wrote back, "Waking up without walls." She never replied to that, but she began to leave questions instead of poems, each one harder than the last. Can silence be honest? Is power a wound or a weapon? What would you do if the gates opened outward instead of inward? You didn't answer the last one because you didn't know. That same week, the palace grew tense. The Sultan's youngest son had fallen ill, possibly poisoned. Rumors spread faster than steam through the hammam. The harem became a beehive. Every woman a suspect, every eunuch an informant. You were summoned by Siladar Mehmed, your old master. He placed a vial on the table, tiny, clear, smelling faintly of bitter almonds. This was found in a robe. He said, not yours, not hers, but in the laundry shared by several unassigned women. Esma's name was not on the list, but her handwriting had been found in a hidden poem about the youngest son's future. A metaphor, an image. But it was enough. Words, Mehmet said, can kill. He asked you if you had read her writings. You lied. You said no. He asked if she ever spoke to you. You paused too long. He noticed. That night, he found Esma waiting near the reflection pool. No guards. It's just a single oil lamp flickering on the water. She said, I know. You didn't pretend. She handed you a folded scroll. It wasn't a poem. It was a confession. Not of guilt, of motive. I did not poison him, she wrote, but I thought about it. 4 weeks, 4 months, 'cause I see what this empire does to women, to children, to men like you. And I wondered what would happen if one crack appeared in the foundation. She looked at you and said, are you the wall or the crack? You could have taken the scroll to Mehmed. You could have burned it. You didn't either. Instead, you asked her, do you want to survive? She said, "No, I want to be seen." The next day, you reported that the scroll had been an unfinished poem, melancholy, but harmless. You offered another one of her older verses, carefully edited, to match her script. You said she had spoken about the Sultan's son only once, and it was with sorrow. Mehmed said nothing, but he gave you a different assignment the next day. Far away, you were sent to the harem of Adorned Palace. Temporary, he said. A matter of trust, but you knew better. You had been moved, not punished, not protected. Barry. Ismay was not exiled, but she was not seen again outside her quarters for months. You waited, no word, no message, until one morning, while sweeping the gallery of Ederen's inner court, you found a scroll tucked beneath the lip of a pillar. It was sealed with a wax rose. Inside, 4 lines. When silence is stitched into the seams of your name, and no room echoes your step, I will remember the gate that didn't close behind you. Oh, I will remember you opened it anyway. There was no signature, just a drawing of a bird, half plucked, half winged, and beneath it, in her faint, looping script, "We aren't what they made us." Not entirely. You never returned to Topkapi, but her words stayed with you. Years later, when the palace changed hands, when new eunuchs arrived, when the old ways grew old enough to be questioned, you were asked to train the next generation. You told them how to listen, how to serve, how to protect. But when one of them asked what your real role had been, said, to know when not to obey. And some nights, when the air was just humid enough to smell of rosewater and old ink, you swore you could hear Esma humming her poetry beneath the silence. And you remembered that even the harem gate didn't lock from both sides. Years passed. The empire thickened like old ink. Sultans came and went. New laws were whispered through corridors before they were ever written. Concubines aged into ghosts behind embroidered screens, and the palace gardens bloomed and withered in silence again and again. But you remained not by choice, by design. You had become part of the invisible structure of the court, the one no one wrote about, the one everyone felt. You were the silence that lived between commands and obedience. Man with no name, no bloodline, no title, but with keys and eyes and memory. At Edorn Palace, your presence grew heavy. You were no longer just a custodian. You were the one others came to when they needed to speak carefully, and sometimes when they needed to say nothing at all. The new eunuchs respected you, feared you even, but they didn't know your past. They didn't know Yzma until the scrolls returned. At first, only one dot left near the bathhouse, sealed in cloth, dry despite the steam. It contained no poetry this time. Asterisk. Just names, women, .eunuchs, .servants, .all moved, all reassigned, all erased from the palace records in the same week. And at the bottom, they remember. I still write. It wasn't signed. But it didn't have to be. You recognized her handwriting, as you would your own reflection. Yzma hadn't been silenced. She'd grown inside the silence. She was still at Topkapi, but no longer a girl, no longer forgotten. A scribe perhaps, a quiet advisor, an invisible seamstress of policy, or maybe something deeper, something the palace still didn't know how to name. You didn't respond, not because you didn't want to, but because your response would have been traced. Even silence, in the wrong hands, could become dangerous. So, instead, you began to act subtly. You reassigned one of your apprentices to the Arkadsen observant boy with a soft voice and a head for patterns. You sent a set of scrolls back to Topkapi via trade couriers carefully. Anonymized, bearing no imperial symbols, but wrapped in fabric you knew she would recognize. The same that lined her pillow years ago. And in those scrolls, or questions. Is the palace still afraid of cracks? Do you still write beneath your breath? Has the gate forgotten how to open? You received no reply for a long time. Until a janissary defected. He was caught near the Armenian quarter, trying to flee with documents sealed with the imperial seal. During the investigation, one parchment fell into your hands. It bore a poem, not political, not treasonous, but unmistakably hers. When walls grow ears, I speak in dust. When records lie, I write in rust. The gates still stand, but I am wind. I never left. I slipped back in, you smiled, and you began to teach differently. You told your students less about memorizing roots and keys, more about remembering voices. You taught them to listen for poetry in patterns, to notice when someone's steps became too careful. When a woman folded her veil twice instead of once, they thought it was about espionage. But it wasn't. It was about protection. You were building something Esma had hinted at long ago, a quiet network within the silence, not to serve power, but to bear witness, to remember what the empire wanted erased. One day, a new concubine arrived from Osnia. Young, thoughtful, quick to observe. You saw the way she glanced at the walls, as if reading them, the way she left stones stacked in odd places always for. You left a scroll in her quarters, blank, except for one line. Do you write what you cannot say? She replied, only in ink no one sees. And you knew Esma had passed something on. Not a rebellion, not a plot, but a language, a code. And you became its protector by the time your bones began to ache and your hands shook from more than memory. You were asked by the chief scribe to dictate your memoirs. History must remember you, he said. You declined, but later that night, you wrote something. Not a memoir, just a scroll. It read, I kept the gates. I heard the breath between footsteps. I saw the truth slide between veils. And I learned the most dangerous thing in an empire isn't the whisper. It's the one who listens and remembers. You sealed it. You sent it to top copy, not to the scribe. To the archives, buried, waiting, because one day someone would open it, and maybe they'd ask, just as Esma had, are you the wall or the crack? And if they were brave enough, they'd write their answer in silence. Asterisk, Rome, 1495. The Borgia household rose like a basilica of secret stall, arrogant, dripping with wine and shadow. Coot, beneath its tiled roofs, moved cardinals, courtiers, confessors, and cooks, and among the cooks, you were 12. Your name didn't matter. It would be forgotten soon enough. You had been taken in from the orphanage near Trastevere. The priest had written down your unusual steadiness, your unblinking attention, your quiet talent with bitter herbs. A noblewoman with the wrong last name had whispered something into a cardinal's sleeve. And within a week, you were placed in the papal kitchens. You didn't know who the Borgias weren't yet, but you knew how to slice garlic. It's thin enough to disappear into oil, and that was enough. You slept beside sacks of salt and stale almonds. You wore aprons, too large for your frame. And every morning, just after the third bell, you stirred milk into the cardinal's porridge, using a spoon made of silver. Always silver, because silver, they said, tarnished in the presence of poison. And you small, patient, silent were trusted to notice when it did. They told you it was a kind of loyalty, but really it was a kind of test, because in the Borgia kitchens, food was not sustenance, it was power, and sometimes punishment. You learned this your first week, when a visiting Florentine bishop sent back a plate of pigeon to Pink, he claimed. That evening, his servant was found convulsing in the latrine, foam on his lips. You watched the sous chef clean the ladle. You didn't speak. You were praised for your discretion. Later that week, the head cook Mariette called you into the herb chamber, a room lit only by oil lamps and a white blur of powdered basil. She handed you a knife. She said, "Cut this root, but don't breathe while you do." You obeyed. It was aconite, wolfsbane, a root that withered hearts. When you finished, she said, "You have a good hand. I think you'll be useful." And that's how it began. Not with daggers, with doses, not with enemies, with guests. You were taught to balance flavor with fear, to lay sweetmeats with just enough belladonna to loosen the tongue, but not the bladder, to mash peach pits into a paste that smelled like almonds but only faintly. You were told not to kill, not yet. Death is wasteful, Marietta said, but a confession, that's a delicacy. You kept a notebook hidden in a dry spot behind the wine casks, not of recipes, of faces. Who liked what? Who refused figs? Who sniffed the cheese too long before tasting? You learned to read fear, and how quickly a man drained his wine. You also learned who tested their food. Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia patriarch himself, was said to trust no one. His taster, a man with half a tongue, stood beside him at every meal. You once watched the Pope take a bite, nod, and then slide the rest of the meat to his son. Saya ate without blinking. He was the only one who didn't flinch at flavor. They said he was immune to poison, that he had built tolerance over years. You didn't know if that was true, but you believed he enjoyed the risk. One night, Marietta woke you from your pallet and handed you a glass vial. Boiled this with figs. Do not taste. You obeyed. You stirred in silence. She added cloves, cinnamon, and a single shiver of saffron. "This is for diplomacy," she whispered. "Served warm, makes the tongue loose. Tea, in the hands still." You brought it upstairs. The chamber was dark, filled with velvet shadows and low murmurs. A French emissary sat at the table, sweating. Cesar Borgia leaned against the window, watching. You set the cup down the emissary drank. He began to speak, quickly, almost joyfully. He said too much. He didn't stop, even when asked to, even when the smile faded from Cesar's face. You were dismissed the next morning. The emissary was found drowned in the Tiber. No wounds, no purse, just a ribbon of fig skin in his teeth. That day, Marietta gave you a fresh apron and a small box of salt. "You're ready," she said. "For what?" You asked. She smiled. "To cook for those who don't know they're already dead." Asterisks. There were no medals in the Borgia kitchens. No promotions. No applause. But there were assignments. And when Marietta handed you the red ribbon tied to a bundle of rosemary sprigs, you knew your life had changed. "Go to the upper villa," she said. "You'll be cooking for Lucretia Borgia, the Pope's daughter." A woman whispered about more than she was spoken to. They called her many things in the alleys. Angel, snake, widowmaker, saint. You had no idea what was true. You only knew she liked grapes peeled of their skin, wine chilled with river stones, and meat roasted with a single drop of honey. No more your first night cooking for her. You expected a test, perhaps a trap, but it was simple. She requested partridge. You prepared it with thyme, conned, and a brush of golden fat across the skin, just as Marietta had shown you. She ate alone at the end of the meal. She asked the steward, "Who made this?" He gave your name, not your real one, the kitchen name they'd given you. She said, "Have them sent back tomorrow." The next night, she asked for eel, then quince jam, then an artichoke boiled in milk. Each time, dishes grew more unusual. Each time, the instructions became more precise. And each time, she ate alone. But you noticed something. She never left leftovers, and she never finished her wine. Always 2 sips. Then the glass was replaced, untouched. You began to wonder, was she the one doing the poisoning, or was she simply avoiding the attempt? One night, You were called to deliver a tray yourself. The chamber was quiet, candles low. Breeze moved the drapes like slow dancers. Lucretia sat beneath a fresco of Saint Cecilia. She wore no jewelry. Her eyes were not cruel. She said, "Sit." You didn't. She smiled. "Good. Obedience is dangerous." She reached for a bowl of stewed prawns and sprinkled crushed rose petals over the top. Then she said, "Do you know the difference between a cure and a poison?" You shook your head. "Asterisk," she said. "Only the amount." You never forgot that from that night forward. Your assignments changed again. You weren't just preparing food. You were preparing moments. Asterisk. A bowl of broth for a PayPal clerk who had begun to talk to freely about the Pope's finances. A sweet pastry laced with a sleeping draft left, in the room of a cardinal who had once been loyal and was now too curious. None of them died, but all of them changed. You were taught how to tilt the balance, not to tip it over. It was an art, and in the Borgia household, art was the most lethal thing of all. You began to work alone. No more kitchen crowd. No more noisy pots and sweaty apprentices. Just you, your herbs, and your mortar. Marietta watched from a distance. She had grown tired. Her hands trembled when she lifted the heavier pans. But she never corrected you. One evening, she simply said, "You can smell lies now, can't you?" You didn't answer, but you could. You knew which foods were requests and which were warnings, which diners were testing you and which were being tested. And sometimes, when no one noticed, you added a little more salt. Not to ruin the dish, but to remind yourself that you were still cooking, still human, still choosing. But that was before the letter arrived, sealed with black wax, no insignia, only a line. "Prepare the wine for Don Alfonso." Alfonso of Aragon, Lucretia's husband. You'd never met him, but you'd heard enough. He was kind, they said, but dull. Unambitious, more suited to a chapel than a court, and in a family like the Borgias. That meant he wouldn't last. You prepared the wine, dark, red, heavy, from the southern vineyards. A favorite of his, but you hesitated with the vial. It was odorless, colorless. You knew what it was, a distillation of white hellebore, enough to weaken the limbs, stop the lungs. It left no trace. You stood there, alone, watching the candle flicker across the glass. And then you did something you've never done. You sipped it, not the poison, the wine, just one drop. You wanted to remember the taste, because what came next wouldn't be remembered, not by him, not by her. The next morning, Alfonso fell. Not immediately. He collapsed in the hall. He lived 3 more days. They said it was a fever, then a curse, then nothing at all. You were not questioned. You were not thanked. You were given a ring, gold, with a carved olive leaf. You left it under a stone in the garden. That night, sat in the kitchens with Marietta. She didn't ask what you had done. She only handed you a peach, soft, perfect, she said. Even fruit rots slowly. And in the quiet that followed, you wondered, was this still cooking? Or had you become something else entirely? Asterisk. After Alfonso died, the palace changed. It didn't mourn, shifted, like a table being quietly reset after a guest vanished. Lucretia wore white for a month. But she didn't weep. She received visitors with eyes like polished glass, reflecting everything, revealing nothing. And you were called deeper into the kitchens of power, no longer for meals, for measures. The Borgias were at war with perception. Enemies from Florence, whispers from France, popes who blinked too often in public, so they began sending gifts. Fine oils, preserved fruits, dried meats packed in rose-scented cloth. Each one bore the signature of the family's wealth, and, sometimes, it's a message hidden in bitterness. You prepared those quietly, with your own hands. Your work was no longer about eating. It was about timing. It's cherry jam laced with trace amounts of oleander, too subtle to kill, but enough to bring visions to a paranoid French nobleman. A candied lemon rind, dusted with powdered licorice and valerian roots, served to a bishop who hadn't slept since he refused. Cesar Borgia's terms. No one died, but a dozen changed their minds, and to simply disappeared. You began to wonder how much of the world's direction had been stirred over a quiet fire in your own pot. One afternoon, Marietta called for you. Her voice was softer than usual. You found her in the herb room, rearranging jars she had memorized years ago. She looked at you and said, "I've forgotten why we started." You said nothing. She took your hand and placed a small folded cloth in your palm. Inside it, a dried rose petal and a black peppercorn, your first ingredient in your first silence. She smiled, barely. "You're the kitchen now." And then she left. She didn't return. No funeral, just a new silence layered on top of the old one. You cooked alone from then on, but you were not lonely because you had become something else. Not a cook, not a poisoner, a translator of hunger. You knew which requests meant fear, which meant loyalty. You could read a recipe like a battle plan, and when Lucretia summoned you herself, one night no servant, betray you understood the gravity before she spoke. "Chaser wants a final meal prepared," she said. "For a guest who doesn't know it will be his last." You didn't flinch. You only asked, "Do I dine with him?" She paused, and for the first time, she looked like a girl again. "No," she whispered. "You dine after." You understood. The guest arrived just before the second bell. A Spanish envoy, young, loud. He praised the food before he'd tasted it. He toasted to every kingdom but the one that fed him. You served him duck, glazed with honey, hand-red vinegar, seasoned with salt and black hellebore, powdered into the spice rub, enough to numb the limbs in stages, enough to allow for a quiet removal. The wine was sweet, too sweet. You hadn't touched it. Not since Alfonso. The envoy laughed, coughed once, then again, and by the time the candles flickered from the draft of the closing door, he was slumped forward, not dead, not yet, but silent. The guards arrived. The body vanished. The plate was cleared. You remained. Later that night, Lucretia came to the kitchen. She sat beside the warm hearth, her slippers silent on the stone. You didn't speak. She didn't order. Instead, she reached into her sleeve and handed you a folded piece of cloth. Inside, list, names, 6 of them, each one familiar. All of them, men, all of them. It's powerful. She didn't explain. She only said, "Make them careful, not dead, not humiliated, just uncertain." You nodded. You returned to your jars, but you didn't reach for the poisons. You chose flavors instead. Too much saffron for the first Manan insult in itself, meant to imply he needed its properties for virility. Too little salt for the second, just enough to suggest his palate was being mocked. An overly rich sweet for the third, coated in rosewater and clove, designed to sit heavily and lead to restless nights. No deaths, no whispers, just meals that made each man glance twice at their servants, at their wives, at themselves. In the next week, the court quieted. One man left for Naples. Unexpectedly, another revoked a decree. The third made a large donation to the PayPal treasury. Lucretia sent you no praise, only a vial of perfume and a silk glove, both laced with bergamot oil, the scent of calm minds and clean escapes. You kept them. You still have them. Years passed. You aged slowly. The kitchens never left you. You trained no one. You replaced no one. But sometimes, when a visiting noble brought his own food tester, I still died of indigestion. The younger cooks whispered your name behind the wine barrels, and you let them because it kept them sharp, and because you knew You had long since stopped cooking for hunger. You cooked for memory, to remind the powerful that trust was a taste they had never fully acquired. And every now and then, when the moon was low and the palace quieted into velvet shadows, you would open your old spice drawer and breathe in the scent of crushed laurel, dried lemon, and clove. And you would remember the girl who said, "Obedience is dangerous." And you would whisper back, "So is the silence that follows it." Asterisk, China. 220 BCE. The Qin dynasty was young, unyielding, and everywhere stone roads cut through mountains. Discipline carved into law, and loyalty carved deeper into fear. The Yellow River was still swollen from late rains, and the Great Wall, newly begun, had already taken more lives than battles. And in the center of this world, breathing its rhythms like a second pulse, was the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. His face was carved into coins, his orders into bamboo slips. His voice was said to crack bone, but his shadow was you. You were 14 when they shaved your head and painted your name onto lacquered wood. Not because you were noble, not because you were gifted, but because your father had whispered a thought that didn't belong in Qin. A question, really. Does unity require silence? That was enough. They took him, and you were offered two paths. One, quick and shallow death. The other, long and narrow service without memory. You chose the second, and so you were given to the emperor's ministry of rights, not to serve tea, to vanish. Your name was burned from the family registry. You were trained in silence before sound, posture before speech, thought before breath, and eventually you were assigned to your place, not beside the emperor, behind him, always 10 steps behind, always 1 degree to the left. You were his shadow servant, one of 6. In his inner ring, your duty was not to carry, not to speak, but to observe, to remember what he forgot. You learned his patterns faster than your own. When he turned toward the sun, you knew it meant he was doubting a decision. When he touched his right sleeve twice in a sentence, it meant he was concealing something. You memorized the creak of his sandals, the change in his gait when he was carrying anger, the subtle lean of his shoulder that meant a punishment was about to fall on someone else. And you learned it slowly, terrifyingly, that he did not sleep. Not truly. He napped. He collapsed. Asterisk. But sleep, as the body knows it, had long since abandoned him. You once saw him staring at a scroll for 5 hours when he finally moved. He said, without looking, "The scroll is not to be read. It is to be obeyed." That scroll, a list of execution, orders, 70 names. He never checked it again. You were taught not to feel, but that day, your hands shook for the first time. You hid them in your sleeves. The other shadows didn't speak of fear, but you noticed their steps growing quieter. You were stationed in his portable chamber when he began his journey eastward, seeking the elixir of immortality. He brought alchemists, he brought astronomers, he brought astrologers, but he brought you too, because a man who believes in nothing believes most in the eyes that don't lie. You slept beneath his tent flap, ate, only after he had finished, and washed your hands in water blessed with salt and dust. He never spoke to you directly until the night he did. He turned, half drunk on fermented rice, stared past the firelight and said, "Do you think I will live forever?" You didn't move. You didn't answer. He laughed. Good. Silence is the only truth left. That night, he didn't sleep again. Instead, he scratched lines into the dirt, over and over. You memorized them later. One of the geomancers said they resembled early scripts from the northwards, once used to describe ghosts. From that day forward, you watched not just the emperor, but the space around him. You noticed how the torches dimmed faster in his chamber, how animals refused to sit near his throne, how his food tasters died more frequently, though no poison was ever found. And you began to believe something unspoken. He was already part ghost. The physicians whispered of mercury. The alchemists whispered of balance. You said nothing, but in your private journal, scratched on bark, and, hidden in a split floor tile, Key began to write down every moment the Emperor repeated himself. Every word he'd said twice. Every time he forgot someone had died. Every time he touched a man's shoulder as if it was still warm when it wasn't. You weren't just his shadow anymore. You were his mirror, and you began to wonder if the Emperor was forgetting the world. Who would remember it for him? Asterisk. The imperial tour grew longer. Months passed, then seasons. The first emperor called it a journey of conquest and unity. But those within the traveling court whispered another word. Escape. Not from rebels, not from enemies, from something far closer. The fear of death followed Qin Shi Huangdi like incense smoke sweet. Constant, choking. Every city he entered was cleansed before his arrival. Every courtier bowed lower. Every sentence was shorter. The closer people came to him, the less they spoke. Except you. You said nothing, but you observed everything. You counted how many times. He blinked when reading a letter. How often his breath stalled after drinking tea. You noticed his robes began to weigh heavier on his frame. His sandals were resoled more frequently, not from wear but from dragging, and he began speaking less to his generals and more to the stars. At dusk, he sat alone with sky maps and tortoise shells, asking the heavens questions he no longer trusted men to answer. He once said, "What I cannot see cannot betray me." But even he looked over his shoulder. Even he checked for shadows, and always found you. You had grown in silence, learned to move in his rhythms. You no longer stepped 10 paces behind him. You knew when 5 was enough, when 2 would be noticed, when 0 was necessary. Because Qin Shi Huangdi's most trusted guard, most invisible protection, was now his own fear of dying alone. And in a strange way, curing your presence was comfort. A constant reminder that someone still knew how to watch without judging Dottie until one night. You did. It began with a cough, barely audible. It's the clearing of the throat. But you knew his patterns. He never coughed. He considered it weakness. He suppressed every human impulse, hunger, sleep, sorrow. Even laughter was rationed. But this sound, it broke the air, and then a second one. Deeper you turned, but did not react. His physician was summoned, then another. The alchemists were called in secret. They arrived with vials, thin scrolls, and trembling hands. You watched as they dripped mercury into tea, whispered charms into steam, burned herbs that made your eyes water, and still, the emperor's lips turned pale. The chief physician began taking notes. The next morning, that physician was gone. No explanation. His assistant took his place. The night after that, Qin Shi Huangdi looked at you directly. No one else, just you. His voice was low. Have I become smaller? Or has the world grown taller? You didn't answer, but the question settled in your spine. Like a cold nail, you began writing more frequently. Not scrolls, not logs, marks on paper just. Vertical lines, each one for a moment when the emperor forgot something he once remembered. The pile grew. Then, one night, he handed you a box. Cedar wood, no carvings, no clasp, that inside. A lock of hair, a piece of silk, and a bone from a deer. He said nothing, but later he learned the box was meant for burial, not of himself, of his soul. A tradition from the old lands, before Qin, a way of tricking the afterlife. If a soul was buried in a token box, the real man could walk free. You returned the box the next day, but you added one thing, a folded paper, blank. You left it on top, and when he opened it, stared for a long time, then said, "Even emptiness must be carried." From that night on, kept it by his bed. But the coughing worsened. The journey halted. He refused to show weakness, but his tent grew quieter. Guards began whispering about succession. Ministers began writing letters in secret, and you were summoned. Again, this time by the emperor's chamberlain. Not to serve, to watch. We need someone, he said, who will see what happens and say nothing. You nodded, but in your mind, you asked, if the man I serve disappears before he dies, who is it that I now follow? The next night, Chen Shi Huangdi collapsed, not in his sleep, in mid-sentence. He had been speaking to an empty scroll, dictating a proclamation that had no recipient. You caught him gently before. His body struck the stone, and for the first time in years, you spoke. Only 2 words. I'm here. He looked at you and said, then let me be gone. He died before the moon reached its peak, but the empire didn't know. Not yet. His body was placed in a sealed cart, packed in ice, disguised as an ordinary merchant's transport. You were one of 3 who knew the truth, and your silence would be tested more deeply than ever before. Because for now, the emperor still lived, and if anyone learned otherwise, so would the rebellion. Asterisk, the cart was sealed before dawn. Wood, lacquered, dark, lined with damp cloth and blocks of ice. You were ordered to ride beside it, not as a guard, as a shadow, once. Again, except this time, the shadow outlived the man it followed. The 2 other attendants didn't speak. One was an alchemist whose eyes had not met yours since the death. The other, a scribe whose hands trembled even while sealing wax. They said little and ate less. Each night, you stopped at designated posts. Villages were warned ahead of time to prepare supplies for the health of the emperor. No one questioned. The orders came sealed in the emperor's own script copied days earlier by the scribe, whose fingers now stained the parchment with sweat. The deception had begun, and you, the silent boy, became part of something larger than any whisper, a lie meant to protect the world from truth, because the death of Chen Shi Huangdi was not just the end of a man, it was the collapse of certainty. He had declared himself eternal, built palaces beneath the mountains to prove it, carved tunnels that no one could walk end to end. He had burned books, rewritten gods, buried scholars. He was not supposed to end, so he wouldn't. Not yet. Not until the succession was secured, and so you rode with the body. The odor came by the 4th day. The ice was failing. The air around the cart soured, though the attendants burned camphor and vinegar by the handful. The villagers were told the emperor was fasting, meditating, that no one could look inside. One peasant boy did. He was found drowned in a well. The next morning, you hadn't killed him, but you saw who had. The scribe. His hands no longer trembled. That night, you watched the cart while the others slept. You didn't open it, but you placed your palm on the wood. Still cold, you whispered, "Is this what unity costs?" There was no answer, but the silence was heavier. At the next stop, the alchemist brewed a paste to hide the smell: cinnamon, resin, plum bark. You recognized it, formula used in the old tombs of the warring states, the kind that said, "This death matters." The scribe asked you to help him forge one more document, a decree, signed in the emperor's seal. It named his youngest son, Hahai, as successor, not the rightful heir, but the one closest, the one easiest to shape. You didn't hesitate. You held the parchment still. You watched the scribe dip the brush, and you knew this lie was no longer just about hiding death. It was about building a future on its back. By the time the imperial party reached Qingtai, the lie was complete. A new emperor was declared. The old one meditated in seclusion. Your cart was taken away by a silent convoy of guards. You never saw the body again, but its weight remained with you, not just in memory, in function, because you became something more than shadow now. You became continuity. You were given no rank, no robes, but every official addressed you carefully. Every new servant watched you from the corner of their eye. They didn't know what you had done, but they sensed what you could become and who high. Hey, he feared you. He smiled when you entered. Asterisk. But only with his lips. One night, he summoned you, just the two of you. He poured tea himself, then said, "You were with my father when he died." He didn't respond. He leaned closer. "Tell me his last words." You paused, then spoke the only sentence that could not be used against anyone. He said, "Let me be gone." Ha! Blinked slowly, then nodded. "That is good," he said. "That is very good." He dismissed you. You never drank the tea. But in the days that followed, 2 other officials did. Both died quietly in the night, and the new Kemper's path cleared. You returned to the archives, to your own chamber, to the journal you had hidden years before. You turned to a fresh bark sheet and wrote, "I walked behind a man who believed he could erase death. And now I walk beside a boy who believes he can erase memory." You did not sign your name. You never had to, because the record was not for history. It was for those who would one day open the tomb, the one being built even now in want, wars of Mercury, with stars carved into ceilings, with 8,000 terracotta soldiers facing outward, not to defend the emperor in death, but to prevent the living from finding what was hidden inside. You once asked yourself, who would remember the world the emperor forgot? And now, you knew it would be you, not through rebellion, not through revenge, but through quiet, through the shadows that learned how to hold light without letting it burn, because you had seen the cost of unity, and you had learned the lesson no decree could write. What lives forever must never be seen. Dying